Imagine a child born in a small rural village. No electricity, no modern schools, no sign that the world would ever know his name. Yet, that child would grow up to become one of the most respected leaders in human history. A man who would spend 27 years in prison and still emerge with a message of peace instead of revenge. That man was Nelson Mandela. But before he became a global symbol of freedom, he was just a young boy growing up in the hills of South Africa. Today, we begin the story of how a village child became a leader who changed the world. The story of Nelson Mandela begins on July 18, 1918. He was born in a tiny village called Mvezo, located in the rural Eastern Cape region of South Africa. At that time, South Africa was already deeply divided by race and inequality. Black South Africans had very limited rights. Opportunities for education, jobs, and political power were extremely restricted. No one in that quiet village could have imagined that the newborn child would someday lead the nation. But Mandela's early life would shape the values that later defined him. Although Mandela grew up in a rural environment, he came from an important family. His father, Gadla Henry Mpakanyasva, was a chief and advisor to the king of the Thembu people. This meant Mandela belonged to a respected royal lineage. In traditional Thembu society, leadership carried great responsibility. Leaders were expected to listen to the community, solve conflicts, and guide their people wisely. As a young child, Mandela often watched tribal elders gather under trees to discuss important issues. These meetings left a deep impression on him. Years later, Mandela said he learned the importance of listening before speaking from these early gatherings. At birth, Mandela received the name Rolihlahla. In the local Xhosa language, this name literally means pulling the branch of a tree. But in everyday speech, it can also mean troublemaker. Interestingly, this nickname would later seem almost prophetic, because as an adult, Mandela would challenge powerful systems and authorities. However, the name Nelson was given to him later by a teacher at school. At the time, many African students were given English names in colonial schools. Mandela's childhood was simple but rich in culture and tradition. He grew up herding cattle, playing with friends, and exploring the hills around his village. Children in rural communities learned important life skills early. They helped with family responsibilities and spent time outdoors. But Mandela also grew up listening to stories from tribal elders. These stories were about African heroes, great warriors, leaders who defended their people. These tales filled his imagination with ideas of courage and justice. Although he did not yet understand politics, these stories planted the seeds of leadership in his mind. When Mandela was about 9 years old, his life changed dramatically. His father passed away. After his father's death, Mandela was taken to live with Jangan Dalindyebo, the acting king of the Thembu people. This move brought Mandela into a completely different environment. Instead of living in a small village, he now lived in the royal residence. Here he observed leadership at a much higher level. He watched how decisions were made and how leaders handled conflicts. These experiences would later influence his own leadership style. Education played a major role in Mandela's early life. He attended a Methodist mission school where he learned reading, writing, and history. At the time, education for Black South Africans was limited, but Mandela quickly showed curiosity and determination. Teachers noticed his discipline and intelligence. It was here that he received the name Nelson. Mission schools also exposed Mandela to new ideas about politics, justice, and equality. He began to realize that the world outside his village was much larger and much more complicated. As Mandela grew older, he began to notice the harsh realities of life in South Africa. Black South Africans faced discrimination and restrictions in many parts of society. Opportunities were limited, rights were unequal. Although Mandela was still young, he began to understand that his country was deeply divided. These early observations would later motivate him to challenge injustice. At this stage of his life, however, Mandela was still discovering who he was and what path he would follow. By his teenage years, Mandela had developed a strong sense of responsibility. He admired leaders who defended their people and stood for justice. but he also knew that education would be the key to creating change. The young boy from the village was beginning to imagine a bigger future, a future beyond the hills of his childhood home. One that would eventually lead him to cities, universities, and political movements. But his journey was only just beginning. The world remembers Nelson Mandela as a global icon of freedom and justice. But his story began in a quiet rural village. His childhood experiences, family traditions, leadership lessons, and early education helped shape the man he would become. No one in that village could have predicted the future waiting for him, but the seeds of leadership were already there. And in the next chapter of this story, a young Mandela will leave his rural home and step into a world that will challenge him in ways he never imagined, because the journey of a future leader has only just begun.